Welcome, dear listeners. I'm Ailey, your host from Cafe Tales, and I'm so glad you're here tonight. These mysteries remind us how trust can be tested in the most unexpected ways. Tell me in the comments, have you ever felt betrayed by a close friend? I'd love to hear your stories. Don't forget to subscribe, as new Miss Marple tales arrive every day. Now wrap yourself in your blanket or pour a cup of tea, and let's begin. The November rain had been falling steadily since dawn, drumming against the mullioned windows of Gossington Hall with the persistence that only an English drizzle could achieve. Mrs. Dolly Bantry stood at the morning room window, watching the drops chase each other down the glass, and reflected that it was exactly the sort of weather to make one feel thoroughly disagreeable about everything. "I do hope people won't cry off because of the weather," she murmured to her husband, Colonel Arthur Bantry, who was attempting to disappear behind the Times in his leather armchair. "Nonsense," came the colonel's gruff reply from behind the newspaper. "A little rain never hurt anyone. Besides, it's for the hospital fund. People have a duty." Mrs. Bantry smoothed her sensible tweed skirt and glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. 2:30. The committee members would begin arriving soon for their 3-hour meeting. She had spent the morning arranging chrysanthemums in the various rooms, instructing Mrs. Bedos about the tea arrangements, and generally fussing about in the way that hostesses do when they want everything to be perfect. The sound of motor cars crunching on the gravel drive announced the first arrivals. James, the elderly butler, who had served the Bantrys for nearly 20 years, appeared in the doorway with his usual dignified bearing. "Mrs. Clement and Miss Marple have arrived, madam, and Mr. Simmons is just behind them." "Splendid." Mrs. Bantry patted her graying hair and prepared to receive her guests. "Show them into the drawing room, James. We'll have tea there before we begin." The drawing room soon filled with the familiar faces of St. Mary Mead's most dedicated, charitable souls. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, arrived in a flurry of damp mackintosh and earnest conversation about the proposed new ward. Her husband, the Reverend Leonard Clement, followed more sedately, shaking the rain from his umbrella. Miss Jane Marple, that deceptively mild-mannered spinster, with her knitting bag and gentle smile, settled herself in a corner chair where she could observe the entire room. Mr. Simmons, the solicitor, spread his papers on a small table with methodical precision. Mrs. Mabel Finch, who ran the village stationery shop and had volunteered to print the programs, clutched a portfolio of samples with the nervous energy of someone determined to prove her worth. It was just as James was serving the tea that the most unexpected guest of all arrived. "Mr. Lionel Wychley," James announced with a slight elevation of his eyebrows that suggested his professional composure was being tested. Mrs. Bantry nearly dropped her teacup. Lionel Wychley was a name she knew well from the society pages of the London papers, though she had never imagined he would darken her doorway. He was a thin, sharp-featured man with prematurely silver hair, and the sort of pale, intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw for future use. His column, Wychley's World, was notorious for its waspish observations about the great and the not-so-great. "Mrs. Bantry, how delightful. I do hope you don't mind my dropping in. I happen to be in the neighborhood covering the charming rustic charity work for my readers. Such dedication to good causes in the countryside is quite refreshing." The way he said charming rustic made it sound like an insult wrapped in silk. Mrs. Bantry felt her cheeks grow warm but maintained her hostess. "Smile." "Not at all, Mr. Wychley, though I'm surprised you'd find our little committee meeting of interest to your London audience." "Oh, but I do. The authentic spirit of village philanthropy. The dedicated volunteers." His eyes swept the room, cataloging faces and no doubt already composing cutting observations. "Though I must say I'd be fascinated to see how the accounts balance. Creative accounting and charitable endeavors can be so illuminating." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Mrs. Bantry's smile became distinctly forced. "I'm sure you'll find everything in perfect order, Mr. Wychley. Mrs. Clement and I have been most careful with the books." Oh, I'm certain you have been. The emphasis on you was slight but unmistakable. Still, one does hear whispers. Nothing serious, I'm sure, but in my experience, where there's smoke— Colonel Bantry lowered his newspaper with a rustling that sounded ominous. Are you suggesting something irregular, sir? Heavens, no. Merely expressing professional interest in how these rural fundraising efforts are managed. Transparency is so important, don't you think? It was at that moment that the door opened again, and Mrs. Bantry felt a wave of relief as her cousin Veronica entered, followed by her friend. Darling Dolly, I'm so sorry we're late. Veronica Denham swept into the room with the sort of elegant assurance that only comes from years of London society life. She was impeccably dressed despite the weather, her dark hair perfectly waved, her complexion flawless. Behind her came a woman of similar age, but with a kind of poise that seemed almost theatrical in its perfection. This is my dear friend, Miss Iris Dacre, Veronica continued. Iris, you must meet my cousin, Mrs. Bantry. We've come down from town for a few days of country air. Miss Dacre smiled with practiced charm, extending a gloved hand. There was something about her bearing, a certain awareness of angles and lighting, that suggested stage experience. Her voice, when she spoke, had the clear diction of trained speech. How kind of you to include us, Mrs. Bantry. Veronica has told me so much about Gossington Hall. Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing from her corner, looked up from her knitting. How lovely to have visitors from London. Miss Dacre, have we perhaps met before? You have such a familiar face. A fleeting expression crossed Miss Dacre's features, too quick to interpret. I don't believe so, though one does get about, doesn't one? The conversation that followed was stilted, with Mr. Wychley continuing to make pointed observations about charitable organizations and their oversight. Mrs. Bantry found herself growing increasingly irritated by his insinuations. Finally, she could bear it no longer. If you're so concerned about our accounting, Mr. Wychley, perhaps you'd care to examine the ledger yourself. I'll see you at 4 with the books, if you insist on this investigation. The words came out sharper than she had intended, and she immediately regretted them. The room fell silent, except for the persistent pattering of rain against the windows. Wychley's smile was thin and triumphant. How very generous of you, Mrs. Bantry. 4. It is. I do so appreciate thoroughness. As the committee meeting proceeded, discussing ward improvements and fundraising targets, the atmosphere remained charged with unspoken tension. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, but her mild blue eyes missed nothing of the undercurrent, swirling through the room. The rain continued to fall, and Gossington Hall seemed to absorb the gloom, its old walls holding secrets as surely as they held the warmth within. The committee meeting had concluded by 3 bows, with the usual flurry of papers being gathered and final arrangements being confirmed. The November afternoon was drawing in early, and the persistent rain had cast a gray pall over Gossington Hall that made the electric light seem particularly welcome. Mrs. Bantry watched from the drawing-room window as the last of the committee members departed, their figures hunched against the weather as they hurried to their motor cars. Only Veronica and Miss Dacre remained as house guests, and of course that dreadful man Wychley, who had made himself comfortable in the library with a whiskey and soda, apparently in no hurry to leave before their appointed meeting. I do wish you hadn't agreed to show him the books, Dolly, Colonel Bantry muttered, settling back into his chair with evident displeasure. Fellow's nothing but a scandal-monger. No good will come of pandering to his sort. I know, Arthur, but what else could I do? He was practically accusing me of embezzlement in front of everyone. Mrs. Bantry twisted her hands nervously. At least this way, when he sees everything is in perfect order, he'll have nothing to write about. Miss Marple, who had lingered over her tea, looked up from her knitting with that gentle expression that somehow managed to convey both sympathy and shrewd observation. I'm sure Mr. Wychley will find everything quite satisfactory, my dear. Though, I must say, it's curious how some people seem to delight in making others uncomfortable. Veronica Denham emerged from the powder room looking as perfectly composed as ever, despite the dampness of the day. What a thoroughly unpleasant man that columnist is. Iris was quite shaken by his manner. She's gone upstairs to lie down. I'm not surprised, Mrs. Bantry replied. He has that effect on people. There's something almost predatory about the way he looks at one, as if he's searching for weaknesses. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 4 hours with its familiar resonant tones. Mrs. Bantry glanced toward the morning room, where she had arranged to meet Wychley with the hospital fund ledger. She had placed it on the escritoire earlier, along with all the relevant receipts and correspondence. Well, I suppose I'd better get this over with, she sighed, smoothing her skirt and checking her appearance in the mirror above the fireplace. She made her way through the hall, past the umbrella, stand and the small table where James always placed the afternoon post. The morning room door stood slightly ajar, and she could see a sliver of the familiar space beyond. The comfortable chairs, the escritoire by the window, the shelves lined with a collection of novels and poetry books. It was 10 minutes past 4, by the hall clock when it happened. A sharp cry rang out from the morning room. Not a scream exactly, but a sound of shock and pain that cut through the quiet afternoon like a blade. It was followed immediately by the heavy thud of something falling. Mrs. Bantry, who had been just approaching the door, broke into a run. Behind her, she heard the colonel's chair creak as he rose, and the rapid footsteps of James emerging from the pantry, where he had been polishing silver. She pushed open the morning room door and stopped dead on the threshold, her hand flying to her throat in horror. Lionel Wychley lay crumpled beside the escritoire, his thin frame twisted at an unnatural angle. The bronze letter opener that normally resided in the desk tidy was buried to the hilt in his back, just below the left shoulder blade. A dark stain was spreading across his expensive gray suit, but it was not just the sight of the body that made Mrs. Bantry gasp. Clutched in Wychley's right hand was something that made her blood run cold. Her own silk scarf, the one with her monogram embroidered in the corner, the one she had been wearing that very morning. Good God! Colonel Bantry's voice came from behind her as he reached the doorway. Dolly, don't go in there. James, telephone for the police at once and Dr. Haydock. But Mrs. Bantry was staring at the scene before her, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The air in the room carried the familiar scent of her violet sachet, the one she always kept in her handkerchief drawer. Yet underneath that familiar fragrance was something else, a faint theatrical smell that she couldn't quite place, something artificial and slightly unpleasant. The letter opener, she whispered. I used it this morning to open the post. My fingerprints will be all over it. James had already hurried away to make the telephone calls, his usual measured pace abandoned in favor of something approaching haste. Within minutes, the hall was filled with the sound of arriving motor cars and urgent voices. Inspector Slack arrived first, his ruddy face grim with the importance of the occasion. He was followed closely by Dr. Haydock, the local physician, whose medical bag and businesslike manner brought a sense of professional competence to the chaos. Nobody is to touch anything, Inspector Slack announced, taking charge of the scene with obvious relish. Mrs. Bantry, I'll need to speak with you immediately. Colonel, perhaps you could gather everyone else in the drawing room. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the body, his examination brief, but thorough. Dead for perhaps 10 minutes, he announced. Single wound delivered with considerable force. The angle suggests the attacker was standing behind and slightly to the right of the victim. Inspector Slack's small, sharp eyes took in every detail of the scene. The letter opener with its ornate bronze handle, the monogrammed scarf, the violet scent that hung in the air like an accusation. "This your scarf, Mrs. Bantry?" he asked, producing a handkerchief to lift it carefully from the dead man's grasp. Yes, she whispered. But I don't understand how it got there. I wasn't wearing it this afternoon. I left it upstairs after lunch. And the letter opener? I used it this morning to open the post. It's been sitting on the desk all day. Inspector Slack made careful notes, his manner becoming increasingly official. Dr. Haydock, what would you say about the time of death? The hall clock shows 4:10, and that's when we heard the cry. Consistent with my examination. Death would have been very nearly instantaneous with a wound like this. Miss Marple appeared quietly in the doorway, her knitting bag in her hand, and her mild blue eyes taking in the scene with careful attention. She said nothing, but Inspector Slack noticed her presence. Miss Marple, I understand you were here for the committee meeting. Did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Wychley's behavior? He seemed rather aggressive, Inspector, particularly toward Mrs. Bantry. There was some unpleasantness about the hospital fund accounts. Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose with interest. Was there indeed? And you, Mrs. Bantry, had arranged to meet the deceased here at 4 to discuss these accounts? Yes, but I was running a few minutes late when I heard the cry. Mrs. Bantry's voice trailed off as the implications of the inspector's questions became clear. I see. So, you had a public disagreement with the victim, arranged to meet him privately, and we find him dead with your personal belongings clutched in his hand. Inspector Slack's tone was becoming decidedly unfriendly. Mrs. Bantry, I'm afraid I must ask you not to leave the house until this matter is resolved. Colonel Bantry stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. See here, Inspector, you can't seriously suspect my wife of murder. I suspect whoever the evidence points to, Colonel, and at the moment that evidence is pointing in a very specific direction. Miss Marple cleared her throat delicately. Inspector, might I ask, were the morning room windows latched when you arrived? Inspector Slack looked at her impatiently. What's that got to do with anything? Oh, perhaps nothing at all. It's just that I noticed them securely fastened and I was wondering when they were last opened. This dreadful weather, you know, does tend to keep things shut up tight against the damp. The windows have been latched all day, Mrs. Bantry said quickly. Mrs. Bedos aired the room this morning before the meeting, but they've been closed since then because of the rain. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her knitting needles clicking as she absorbed this information. In the growing gloom of the November afternoon, with the rain still pattering against those securely latched windows, Gossington Hall felt more like a trap than a home. Inspector Slack had commandeered the colonel's study as his temporary headquarters, and by evening he had assembled what he clearly considered a damning collection of evidence. The various items were laid out on the mahogany desk like exhibits in a court of law, each one seeming to point inexorably toward Mrs. Bantry's guilt. Now then, he said with evident satisfaction, addressing the small group he had gathered in the drawing room. Mrs. Bantry sat rigidly in her usual chair, her face pale but determined. Colonel Bantry stood behind her like a loyal sentinel, while Miss Marple occupied her corner seat, her knitting needles moving in their steady rhythm. Let's review what we know about this afternoon's events. He consulted his notebook with the air of a man who enjoyed having an audience for his deductive prowess. First, we have the victim's scarf found clutched in the deceased's hand. Mrs. Bantry admits it belongs to her. I've never denied it, Mrs. Bantry said quietly. Second, we have the murder weapon, a bronze letter opener bearing Mrs. Bantry's fingerprints. Again, she admits to handling it. I opened the Morning Post with it, as I do every day. Third, Inspector Slack continued, warming to his theme, we have the matter of the quarrel. In front of multiple witnesses, Mrs. Bantry and the deceased engaged in a heated exchange about the hospital fund accounts, culminating in her arranging to meet him privately at 4:30. Colonel Bantry's mustache bristled. A disagreement is hardly grounds for murder, Inspector. Ah, but there's more. Slack turned to a fresh page in his notebook. I've just finished speaking with Mary, one of the housemaids. She swears she saw Mrs. Bantry slipping into the morning room at 4 just minutes before the cry was heard. Mrs. Bantry started. That's impossible. I was nowhere near the morning room at 4. I was in the drawing room with Arthur and Miss Marple. Mary seems quite certain of what she saw, ma'am. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Tell me, Inspector. Did Mary see Mrs. Bantry's face clearly? She saw enough. The figure was wearing Mrs. Bantry's blue dress and had her general build and coloring. I see. And there's nothing else that might have helped identify the person? Inspector Slack waved a dismissive hand. The girl knows her mistress well enough. But that's not all. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. This was found in the deceased's jacket pocket. He unfolded the note and read aloud. Call on me at 4 dB. The handwriting was neat and upright, formed with careful precision. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward to examine it. But, Inspector, that's not my handwriting at all. My script is nothing like that. People can disguise their writing when they want to, Mrs. Bantry. Miss Marple set down her knitting and moved closer to examine the note. Might I have a look? Her mild blue eyes studied the paper carefully. Such neat penmanship! Almost like a copybook hand, wouldn't you say? Very different from the usual flowing style one develops as an adult. She glanced at Mrs. Bantry. My dear, would you mind writing something for us? Perhaps just your name? And the time. Mrs. Bantry obliged, her natural handwriting flowing across the paper in loose, right-leaning loops that bore no resemblance whatever to the careful script of the note. Most interesting, Miss Marple murmured. And there's something else, Inspector, about the scarf. What about it? Well, it's rather odd, don't you think? I've noticed that Mrs. Bantry always wears her scarves with a little bar pin to keep them from slipping. Such a practical habit. Mrs. Bantry touched her throat instinctively. Why, yes. I always use my little gold safety pin. I can't bear scarves that won't stay in place. Have you searched for it? Miss Marple asked gently. Well, no, not specifically. It might be worth doing. And there's another small matter that puzzles me. Miss Marple returned to her chair and resumed her knitting. The violet scent in the morning room was quite noticeable, wasn't it? Yes, it was Mrs. Bantry's scent, obviously. Oh, I'm sure it was violet sachet. But where does Mrs. Bantry keep her sachets? Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled. In the blue room linen press, of course. I've always kept them there among the linens. How many did you have? 3, I think. Or was it 4? I'm not entirely certain. Miss Marple smiled. Perhaps we might ask Mrs. Bedos to check. Such an excellent housekeeper would surely know exactly what belongs in her linen press. Mrs. Bedos was summoned and confirmed that there should indeed be 4 violet sachets in the blue room press. When sent to count them, she returned with a puzzled expression. There are only 3 there now, madam. One seems to be missing. Inspector Slack made another note, though he looked less pleased than before. Someone could have taken it to plant the scent in the morning room. Yes, Miss Marple agreed mildly. Someone could have, though it does rather suggest premeditation. Doesn't it? Taking the scarf, the sachet, writing the note in that careful hand. It's almost as if someone wanted very much for Mrs. Bantry to be suspected. She paused in her knitting to look directly at the inspector. I wonder, did you notice anything else about the morning room? Any other scents, perhaps? Inspector Slack frowned. What do you mean? Well, underneath the violet, there was something else, wasn't there? Something rather theatrical? Mrs. Bantry nodded eagerly. Yes, I noticed it too, but I couldn't place what it was. Stage grease, Miss Marple said quietly. Or something very like it. The sort of thing actresses use for their makeup. The room fell silent except for the steady ticking of the mantel clock and the persistent drumming of rain against the windows. Inspector Slack's expression had grown distinctly uncomfortable. That's all very well, Miss Marple, but we can't ignore the physical evidence. The scarf, the fingerprints, the maid's testimony. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of ignoring evidence, Inspector. I simply think we should examine all of it very carefully. For instance, that note with its beautiful copybook script. It reminds me so much of the exercises we used to do in school. The quick brown fox and all that, so different from natural adult handwriting." She held up Mrs. Bantry's sample again. "Look at the difference. Mrs. Bantry's hand has developed its own character over the years, but that note looks almost studied, doesn't it?" Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "Inspector, surely you can see that someone is trying to frame my wife. All this evidence is far too convenient. Frame her? Who would want to do such a thing?" Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. "Perhaps someone who needed Mr. Wychley silenced, but also needed to ensure they wouldn't be suspected themselves. What better way than to arrange for someone else to take the blame?" Inspector Slack gathered his evidence with less confidence than he had displayed earlier. "I'll need to investigate further," he admitted grudgingly. "But Mrs. Bantry, you're still not to leave the house." After he had gone, the 3 remaining occupants of the drawing room sat in contemplative silence. The fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, but the atmosphere remained heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry said finally, "do you really think someone deliberately tried to implicate me?" Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with a gentle smile. "My dear Dolly, I think someone went to a great deal of trouble to make it appear that you committed this murder. The question is, who had both the opportunity and the knowledge necessary to arrange such an elaborate deception?" The following morning brought no relief from the persistent November rain, which continued to drum against the windows of Gossington Hall with tireless determination. Miss Marple had arrived early, ostensibly to offer comfort to Mrs. Bantry, but, in reality, to pursue the quiet investigations that had occupied her thoughts through a largely sleepless night. She found Mrs. Bantry in the morning room, which had been released by the police after their examination. The chalk outline on the Aouza carpet had been scrubbed away by the efficient Mrs. Bedos, but the atmosphere of the room still felt heavy with recent tragedy. "I couldn't stay away from here," Mrs. Bantry confessed, standing by the escritoire where Wychley had met his end. "It sounds foolish, but I keep thinking if I look at everything carefully enough, I'll understand what really happened." "Not foolish at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied, settling into one of the comfortable chairs. "Sometimes the scene itself can tell us more than all the witness statements in the world." Inspector Slack had interviewed everyone thoroughly the previous evening, establishing what seemed to be a straightforward timeline. The committee meeting had ended at 3 Harduange. Wychley had remained in the library until nearly 4 Fekaj. The cry had been heard at 10 minutes past 4 by the hall clock, and Mrs. Bantry and James had reached the morning room within moments. "It all seemed so neat," Miss Marple mused, her eyes moving thoughtfully around the room. "Almost too neat, if you'll forgive my saying so." She rose and moved to examine the mantelpiece, where an ornate clock sat among various ornaments and photographs. "This clock shows the time as 25 minutes to 9, she observed. "But my watch, which I set by the post office clock only this morning, shows 9 exactly." Mrs. Bantry glanced up from where she'd been absently straightening the papers on the escritoire. "Oh, yes, that clock has been running slow for weeks. James mentioned it yesterday morning when he was dusting. It's been losing about 5 minutes a day." "How interesting. So yesterday afternoon when it showed 4, the actual time would have been 5 minutes past 4, I suppose." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the hall clock, I noticed yesterday, keeps perfect time." "Yes, Arthur insists on it. He sets it by the post office every few days." "So when the hall clock showed 10 minutes past 4, the time we heard the cry, this clock would have shown only 5 minutes past." The significance of this observation was interrupted by the arrival of James, who entered carrying a tea tray with the quiet efficiency that had characterized his service for 20 years. "Begging your pardon, madam, but Inspector Slack is here again. He wishes to examine Mr. Wychley's personal effects." Of course, James, show him in. Inspector Slack entered with his usual bustling importance, carrying a small leather case. Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple, I need to go through the deceased's belongings more thoroughly. Sometimes these cases turn on the smallest details. He opened the case and began laying out Witchley's possessions on a small table. Wallet, keys, fountain pen, cigarette case, and finally a gold pocket watch attached to a chain. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. What time does the watch show, Inspector? Slack consulted it with a frown. Exactly. But that's odd. The wind has been pulled out, which would stop the mechanism. How very peculiar, Miss Marple murmured. A watch that stops at precisely 4 hours, just when the murder was supposedly committed. What are you suggesting? Oh, nothing at all. It's just that in my experience, pocket watches don't usually stop themselves. Someone must have pulled that wind out deliberately. Inspector Slack examined the watch more closely. You're right. The wind has been pulled out completely. But why would someone want to stop the victim's watch? Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, where she stood looking out at the rain-soaked garden. To establish a time, perhaps. Though it's curious that they chose 4 hours when we know the actual cry wasn't heard until 10 minutes past. She turned, back to the room, her mild eyes taking in every detail. Inspector, might I ask about the windows yesterday? You examined them, I assume. Of course, they were securely latched, just as Mrs. Bantry said, and the sill beneath them. I couldn't help noticing yesterday that there was a single hellebore glass sitting there, with what appeared to be a ring of moisture underneath. Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled. A hellebore glass? But there are no hellebores blooming yet. It's far too early in the season. Miss Marple moved to the window and examined the sill carefully. Yes, here's the mark. A perfect circle of dampness on the wood, as if something wet had been sitting here for some time. She looked more closely at the glass itself than at the window frame. Most interesting. If this glass had been moved during yesterday afternoon's rain, one would expect to see water spots on the glass itself, wouldn't one? And perhaps some dampness tracking across the sill. Inspector Slack joined her at the window. What are you getting at? Well, it's just that this glass appears completely dry, and the watermark beneath it is perfectly circular. If someone had moved it yesterday afternoon, say around 4:09 when the rain was quite heavy, surely there would be some evidence of that movement. She traced the edge of the watermark with her finger. This looks as though the glass was placed here much earlier, when it was wet from washing perhaps, and then left undisturbed for hours. Mrs. Bantry was following the conversation with growing interest. You mean someone arranged things in this room before 4:00? It would seem so. The stopped watch, the positioning of objects, it all suggests someone who had time to set the scene carefully rather than acting in the heat of passion. Inspector Slack made reluctant notes in his book, but the maid saw Mrs. Bantry entering the room at 4. Yes, that's what Mary said. Though, I wonder. Miss Marple paused, her expression thoughtful. Inspector, did you ask Mary exactly what she saw? Not what she concluded, but what she actually observed? She saw a woman in a blue dress going into the morning room. A woman she assumed was Mrs. Bantry because of the dress and general appearance. But did she see the woman's face clearly? Inspector Slack consulted his notes with growing reluctance. She said she saw the figure from behind, going through the doorway. I see. So someone of similar build, wearing similar clothing, could have deceived her quite easily. The three of them stood in contemplative silence, the implications of Miss Marple's observations settling over the room like the gray November light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. There's one more thing, Miss Marple said quietly, about the timing of that cry we heard. If the murder actually occurred at 4 wow, as the stopped watch suggests, why didn't we hear anything then? Why was there a 10-minute delay before the cry that brought us running? Inspector Slack shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps the victim didn't cry out immediately. Perhaps he was struck down without warning. But then what was the cry we heard at 10 minutes past 4? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time since beginning his investigation, Inspector Slack looked genuinely uncertain about his neat, straightforward case against Mrs. Bantry. The afternoon brought a welcome visitor to Gossington Hall in the form of Sergeant Lake, Inspector Slack's more methodical colleague, who arrived with additional information that promised to shed new light on the case. "We've been making inquiries around the village," he reported to Inspector Slack in the Colonel's study, while Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple, and Colonel Bantry waited anxiously in the drawing room. "Constable Williams was stationed near the lodge yesterday afternoon, and he's got something interesting to tell us." Constable Williams, a young man with the earnest manner of someone determined to prove his worth, was duly summoned and questioned in the presence of the household. "I was keeping an eye on the main road, you see, what with all the rain making the driving treacherous," he explained, consulting his notebook with careful precision. "At about 2 minutes before 4 I checked. My watch, particular-like, I saw a motor car coming down the drive from the hall. It was dark blue." Inspector Slack leaned forward with interest. "Could you see the occupants?" "Just the one person, sir, in the driver's seat, wearing what looked like Mrs. Bantry's hat, the one with a red feather. Very distinctive it is." I thought to myself, there goes Mrs. Bantry nipping out just before her appointment. Mrs. Bantry started in her chair. "But that's impossible. I never left the house yesterday afternoon, and I certainly wasn't wearing that hat." "You're quite certain it was Mrs. Bantry's hat?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Oh, yes, miss. I've seen her wearing it to church many a Sunday. Very stylish it is, with that bright red feather curled around the crown." Mrs. Bantry looked genuinely bewildered. "I do have such a hat, but I haven't worn it in weeks. It's far too frivolous for committee meetings. I left it hanging in the wardrobe in my bedroom." "Perhaps we might have a look at this hat," Miss Marple suggested. Mrs. Bantry led the way upstairs to her bedroom, followed by the small procession of investigators. The hat in question was indeed hanging in the wardrobe, a rather dashing creation, in dark felt with an elaborate scarlet feather that curved dramatically around the crown. Miss Marple examined it with her usual careful attention to detail. Such a beautiful feather, so perfectly arranged and remarkably dry. She held it up to catch the light from the window. "Inspector, if this hat had been worn out in yesterday's heavy rain, would you not expect to see some evidence of dampness? Perhaps some flattening of the feather where the rain had struck it?" Inspector Slack frowned as he examined the hat. "It does look remarkably pristine for something that's been out in that downpour." "There's another possibility," Mrs. Bantry said, slowly. "After lunch yesterday, Veronica admired the hat tremendously. She said it was exactly the sort of thing one saw in the London shops, and she asked if she might try it on. I told her she was welcome to borrow it if she liked." "Did she borrow it?" Miss Marple asked. "I'm not certain. She and Miss Dacre were going up to freshen up before the committee meeting. I assumed she was just being polite about the hat." They found Veronica Denham in the morning room, where she had been attempting to read despite the continuing atmosphere of tension that pervaded the house. She looked up as they entered, her elegant features showing signs of strain. "Veronica," Mrs. Bantry began carefully, "yesterday afternoon when you admired my hat with the red feather—" Her cousin's cheeks colored slightly. "Oh, that. Yes, it really is a lovely hat, Dolly. So much more sophisticated than anything one finds in the country shops." "Did you happen to borrow it?" Veronica's blush deepened. "Well, actually, it wasn't I who wore it. Iris admired it as well, and she asked if she might try it on. You know how theatrical people are about costume and effect. She wanted to see how the silhouette looked." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm. "Miss Dacre wore the hat?" "Only briefly. She said she wanted to test how it looked in natural light. So she went out to the lodge and back. Just a quick turn around the grounds to see the effect in daylight. Inspector Slack made rapid notes. What time was this? Oh, just before 4, I think. She was back within minutes, and then we heard that dreadful cry from the morning room. Miss... Marple rose from her chair and moved to the umbrella stand in the hall, where she began examining the various walking sticks and umbrellas with apparent interest. After a moment, she plucked something tiny from the wickerwork and held it up to the light. How curious, she murmured. A single scarlet barbule. That's the proper name for the individual strands that make up a feather's vein. Such a bright red, just like the feather on Mrs. Bantry's hat. She showed the tiny fragment to Inspector Slack. This was caught in the umbrella stand, as if someone had brushed against it while retrieving or replacing an umbrella. Miss Dacre must have used an umbrella when she went out in the rain, Mrs. Bantry said. Very sensible of her. Yes, very sensible, Miss Marple agreed, though it does raise an interesting question. If Miss Dacre wore the hat out in the rain and used an umbrella to protect herself, why is the hat's feather so remarkably dry and well-preserved? She examined the barbule more closely. Feathers are quite remarkable things. You know, when they get wet in natural rain, the barbules tend to clump together and lose their springy texture. But when they're kept dry, they maintain this lovely, crisp appearance. Inspector Slack was beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable with the direction of Miss Marple's observations. Are you suggesting the hat wasn't actually worn in the rain? I'm not suggesting anything definite, Inspector. I'm simply noting that the physical evidence seems somewhat contradictory. Veronica shifted uneasily in her chair. Perhaps Iris was more careful with the umbrella than I realized. She's always been very particular about her appearance. Where is Miss Dacre now? Miss Marple inquired casually. She's lying down again. The shock of yesterday's events has quite overwhelmed her. She's always been rather sensitive to atmospheres. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Such a trying experience for a house guest. She must wish she had never come to the country. Oh, but she was so looking forward to the visit. She said London had become rather difficult for her recently. Something about unwanted attention from the press. The significance of this remark was not lost on Miss Marple, who filed it away with the same careful attention she gave to all potentially relevant information. Press attention can be most trying, she agreed, particularly if one values one's privacy. She returned to her examination of the umbrella stand, her movements casual but thorough. It's interesting how small things can tell us so much. A single feather barbule, a watermark on a windowsill, a stopped watch. Individually, they might mean nothing, but together they begin to form a pattern. Inspector Slack gathered his notes with less confidence than he had shown earlier. I'll need to speak with Miss Dacre when she's feeling better. Of course, Veronica said quickly, though I do hope you won't upset her further. She's been quite distraught about poor Mr. Wychley. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the hall, her mild blue eyes thoughtful as she continued to examine the umbrella stand and its revealing contents. The red barbule lay carefully preserved in her handkerchief, a tiny but potentially crucial piece in the increasingly complex puzzle of Lionel Wychley's murder. The next development in the case came from an unexpected quarter. Miss Jenkins, the village telephone exchange operator, arrived at Gossington Hall that evening with information that she felt duty-bound to share with the police. Miss Jenkins was a spinster of indeterminate age who had operated the local exchange for nearly 15 years. She possessed the peculiar combination of absolute discretion regarding private conversations and an encyclopedic memory for the technical details of every call that passed through her switchboard. I wouldn't normally intrude, she explained, to Inspector Slack in the drawing room, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. But given the circumstances of poor Mr. Wychley's death, I felt I should mention yesterday's telephone call. Inspector Slack looked up from his notes with renewed interest. What call would that be, Miss Jenkins? The one that came through at 3:45 yesterday afternoon. A lady telephoned Mr. Wychley at the Gossington Arms, where he was staying. She asked to be put through to his room. Did you recognize the voice? Miss Jenkins hesitated. Well, that's just it, Inspector. The lady said she was Mrs. Bantry, but there was something about the way she spoke. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward in her chair. But I made no telephone call yesterday. Afternoon. I was here in the house the entire time. That's what puzzles me, ma'am. You see, I've been putting through calls for Mrs. Bantry for years now, and I know her voice quite well. But yesterday's caller, while she sounded very much like Mrs. Bantry, said things in a way that struck me as odd. Miss Marple sat down her knitting with gentle interest. In what way odd, Miss Jenkins? Well, for one thing, she introduced herself as Lady Bantry speaking. Now, Mrs. Bantry never calls herself Lady when she telephones. She always says Mrs. Bantry, or sometimes just Dolly Bantry. Very natural and friendly she is. Inspector Slack made careful notes. What else did the caller say? She asked Mr. Wychley to meet her at 4:00 in the small room. When he asked which room she meant, she said, the small room, not the morning room. That struck me as peculiar, too, because Mrs. Bantry always calls it the morning room. I've heard her give directions to tradesmen dozens of times, and it's always the morning room or the morning room at the front of the house. Mrs. Bantry nodded emphatically. Miss Jenkins is absolutely right. I would never refer to it as the small room. It's always been the morning room to me. Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet clicking. How interesting that someone would use such formal language, Lady Bantry and the small room, almost as if they were unfamiliar with a natural way of speaking about familiar things. There was something else, Miss Jenkins continued. The voice quality itself. It was definitely similar to Mrs. Bantry's, the same general tone and accent, but it seemed rather careful, as if the speaker was concentrating very hard on each word. Inspector Slack looked up sharply. Careful in what way? Well, you know how when people are trying to disguise their voice, they tend to speak more slowly and deliberately. It was rather like that. And there was an odd little pause before she said Lady Bantry, as if she had to think about it first. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window, where she stood looking out at the gathering dusk. Miss Jenkins, you mentioned that the call came through at 3:45. How long did the conversation last? Not more than a minute or two, just long enough to arrange the meeting. And where did the call originate? Could you tell? Miss Jenkins consulted a small notebook she had brought with her. That's another curious thing. It came from inside Gossington Hall itself, from one of the house extensions. Mrs. Bantry looked startled. But we have 3 extensions. One in the hall, one in Arthur's study, and one in the blue room. The blue room? Miss Marple turned from the window with renewed interest. Yes, it's a little ante-room off the blue room that was used for nursing supplies. And we had a telephone. Extension put in there so the nurses could make calls without disturbing the patient. Inspector Slack made more notes. I'll need to examine all 3 telephones for fingerprints. Of course, Mrs. Bantry agreed. Though I should mention that James polishes the telephone in the hall every morning, and Arthur uses the one in his study regularly for business calls. What about the blue room extension? That one is rarely used now. It's rather tucked away in the anteroom, and most people forget it exists. Miss Marple moved quietly from the room, and the others could hear her footsteps on the stairs. She returned a few minutes later, carrying a handkerchief pressed to her nose. Most interesting, she murmured. Inspector, you might want to examine the blue room extension particularly carefully. They all made their way upstairs to the blue room, which was decorated in elegant blue and white toile. The anteroom Miss Marple mentioned proved to be a small, windowless space that had once held medical supplies but now served as a storage area for extra linens. The telephone sat on a small shelf, and Miss Marple approached it with careful attention. Inspector, might I suggest you examine this mouthpiece rather closely? Inspector Slack did so, producing a magnifying glass from his kit. After a moment, he looked up with surprise. There's a faint smear of something on the mouthpiece. Something violet-scented, rather like the violet sachet scent we noticed in the morning room. Very much like it, Miss Marple suggested gently. Mrs. Bantry examined the telephone with puzzlement. But who would have used this extension? And why would there be violet scent on it? Miss Marple's mild blue eyes were thoughtful. Perhaps someone who had been handling one of your missing sachets, my dear, or someone who had violet scent on their hands for some other reason. She paused, her expression growing more serious. Miss Jenkins, when you heard this telephone conversation, did you notice any background sounds? Any indication of where in the house the caller might have been? Miss Jenkins considered carefully. Now that you mention it, there was a slight echo to the voice, as if the caller was in a small enclosed space, rather like this anteroom. Yes, very much like that. Inspector Slack was examining the small space more thoroughly now, his professional interest clearly aroused. It's quite private here, isn't it? Someone could make a call without being overheard by anyone else in the house. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. And if someone wanted to impersonate Mrs. Bantry on the telephone, this would be an ideal place to practice and make the call without interruption. She moved to the linen press and opened it carefully. I wonder, Mrs. Bantry, you mentioned that your violet sachets were kept in here. Yes, on the middle shelf, wrapped in tissue paper. Miss Marple examined the shelf closely, then looked up with interest. There seems to be a faint impression in the dust here, as if something had been resting on this spot for some time, and was recently removed. She also noticed something else. A very faint greasy mark on the edge of the shelf, barely visible unless one looked at just the right angle. Inspector, she said quietly, I think you'll find this case is becoming rather more complex than it first appeared. Someone went to considerable trouble to arrange yesterday's events, including impersonating Mrs. Bantry on the telephone to lure Mr. Wychley to his death. The small group stood in the confines of the anteroom, the implications of Miss Marple's discoveries settling over them like the gathering darkness outside the hall's windows. Miss Marple had always been a poor sleeper, and the events at Gossington Hall had done nothing to improve her nocturnal rest. She found herself lying awake in the small guest room that Mrs. Bantry had insisted she occupy, her mind turning over the various pieces of evidence like a seamstress examining a particularly complex pattern. At 11 she gave up any pretense of sleep and rose quietly from her bed. The house was silent except for the familiar creaking of old timbers and the continued patter of rain against the windows. She wrapped her dressing gown around her shoulders and made her way carefully down the corridor toward the blue room. The investigation of the linen press had been necessarily brief that afternoon, conducted under Inspector Slack's rather impatient supervision. But Miss Marple had noticed several details that warranted closer examination, and the quiet hours of the night seemed ideal for such delicate work. She was surprised to find Sergeant Lake in the hallway outside the blue room, clearly on the same mission. Miss Marple, he whispered, his voice barely audible in the darkness. I hope I didn't disturb you. Inspector Slack asked me to make a more thorough examination of the linen press. How thoughtful of him, Miss Marple replied with gentle approval. I confess I was hoping to take another look myself. Perhaps we might work together. Mrs. Beddoes appeared from the servants' staircase, carrying a candle and wearing a thick woolen dressing gown. I heard voices, she explained in hushed tones. Mrs. Bantry asked me to assist with anything the police might need, no matter the hour. The three of them entered the blue room quietly, Mrs. Beddoes lighting several additional candles to provide adequate illumination for their work. The linen press stood against the far wall, its dark wood gleaming in the flickering light. Now then, Miss Marple said softly, opening the press doors with careful hands, let's see what we can discover. The shelves were neatly arranged with the precision that marked Mrs. Beddoes as an exemplary housekeeper. Sheets, pillowcases, and towels were folded with military accuracy and arranged according to size and frequency of use. The sachets are kept on this middle shelf, Mrs. Bedos indicated, pointing to a space between stacks of embroidered pillowcases. 3 of them there should be now, wrapped in tissue paper. Miss Marple examined the area carefully, her fingers tracing the faint depression in the dust that she had noticed earlier. Sergeant Lake, might I trouble you to hold the candle closer? In the enhanced light, the impression became more distinct. Something rectangular, about the size of a sachet, had indeed rested in this spot for some time before being recently removed. There's something else, Miss Marple murmured, examining the edge of the shelf where she'd spotted the greasy mark. This stain is quite fresh, I believe. Mrs. Bedos, when did you last clean these shelves thoroughly? Just last week, Miss Marple. I do the Blue Room linen press every Monday without fail. Then this mark has appeared since then. Miss Marple held her candle closer to the stain. It looks rather like the sort of mark one might make with theatrical makeup, doesn't it? The kind actresses use to enhance their complexions under stage lighting. Sergeant Lake made careful notes by candlelight. That would be consistent with our growing suspicions about Miss Dacre's involvement. Indeed, but there's more to discover. I think Miss Marple began a systematic examination of the press contents. Mrs. Bedos, have you noticed anything else unusual about the linens recently? The housekeeper considered carefully. Well, now that you mention it, there was something odd earlier today. When I was putting away the washing, I found this caught in one of the towels. She produced a small object from her apron pocket. A tiny gold bar pin, the sort used to secure scarves and light fabrics. Miss Marple accepted it with evident interest. How very curious. This looks exactly like the type of pin Mrs. Bantry mentioned using to secure her scarves. She examined it closely in the candlelight and made a small sound of satisfaction. Sergeant Lake, look at this carefully. The pin is slightly bent, as if it had been used to fasten something under tension. And there, caught in the clasp mechanism, are those not 2 tiny red fibers? The sergeant peered at the pin through his magnifying glass. By George, you're right. They look like feather barbules, the same bright red as Mrs. Bantry's hat. Precisely. Someone used this pin to attach Mrs. Bantry's scarf to the red feather on her hat. When the pin was removed, it retained these tiny fragments as evidence. Mrs. Bedos looked puzzled. But why would anyone want to attach a scarf to a hat feather? To create a more convincing disguise, I believe, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. If someone of similar build to Mrs. Bantry wore a hat and had a scarf attached to it, a casual observer might well conclude they had seen Mrs. Bantry herself. Sergeant Lake was making detailed notes of their discoveries. This supports the constable's testimony about seeing Mrs. Bantry leaving in the motor car. Yes, though we now know the feather remained mysteriously dry despite the heavy rain. Miss Marple continued her examination of the linen press. There's one more thing I'd like to investigate. She moved to examine the Blue Room fireplace, where the ashes of the previous day's fire lay cold and gray. Kneeling carefully beside the hearth, she began to sift through the debris with a knitting needle. What are you looking for? Sergeant Lake asked quietly. Evidence of what might have been burned yesterday evening. Miss Marple's needle caught something small and dark. Ah, here we are. She extracted a minute curl of what appeared to be glossy paper, charred but still partially intact. This looks like the type of paper used to coat artificial things, the kind used in theatrical work to give objects a polished, professional appearance. Mrs. Bedos leaned closer to examine the fragment. It's such a tiny piece. What could it have come from? I suspect it came from treating feathers with shellac or similar substances to make them appear fresh and properly arranged after they've been damaged by weather, Miss Marple replied. Someone burned the evidence of their restoration work. She carefully wrapped the fragment in a handkerchief and turned back to the linen press for one final examination. Her methodical search revealed one more significant detail. a faint trace of the same greasy substance she had found on the shelf. This time on the inside of the press door. Someone opened this press recently while wearing stage makeup, she concluded. The evidence suggests they removed one of Mrs. Bantry's violet sachets, used Mrs. Bantry's bar pin to attach her scarf to the hat feather, and later burned materials used to restore the feather's appearance after it had been exposed to rain. Sergeant Lake closed his notebook with satisfaction. This provides a clear picture of premeditation and elaborate deception. Indeed, someone went to considerable trouble to create false evidence against Mrs. Bantry while concealing their own involvement in Mr. Wycherley's murder. As they prepared to leave the Blue Room, Miss Marple paused to look back at the linen press, its contents now yielding secrets that painted a picture of calculated deception. "The question now," she said quietly, "is whether we have sufficient evidence to confront the real murderer." The three conspirators made their way back through the darkened corridors of Gossington Hall, each lost in thought about the significance of their midnight discoveries. The following morning brought a subtle change in atmosphere at Gossington Hall. Inspector Slack had arrived early, his manner suggesting that the midnight discoveries had shifted his perspective considerably. He was no longer the confident investigator certain of Mrs. Bantry's guilt, but rather a man beginning to realize that his case was built on carefully constructed deceptions. Miss Marple found him in the scullery of all places, crouched beside the large cooking range with Sergeant Lake and a magnifying glass. The scullery was Mrs. Bedos's domain, a spotless realm of copper pots and scrubbed surfaces that served as the working heart of Gossington Hall's domestic arrangements. "Ah, Miss Marple," Inspector Slack said, looking up from his examination. "I thought you might be interested in this. We've been following up on your suggestion about burnt materials." He indicated the cold grate of the scullery range, where the previous day's ashes had been carefully preserved at his request. Mrs. Beddoes mentioned that someone asked for matches after tea yesterday. The housekeeper, who stood nearby with her arms folded, nodded emphatically. "That would be Miss Dacre, Inspector. She came down to the scullery just after 4 looking rather flustered. Said she needed a match to seal a letter, and would I mind if she used the range?" "Did she have a letter with her?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Well, that's just it, miss. I didn't see any letter. She had something in her hands, but it looked more like bits of feather, if you must know." Inspector Slack had resumed his careful sifting of the ashes. "Look at this, Miss Marple." He held up several charred fragments on the blade of a kitchen knife. Even in their damaged state, it was possible to identify them as pieces of feather that had been treated with some kind of stiffening agent. The burnt edges showed traces of what appeared to be shellac, and there were minute beads of a greasy eye-shaped substance that had melted and hardened again. "Grease paint?" Miss Marple observed with satisfaction. "Just as we suspected from the scent in the morning room." "But why would Miss Dacre be burning feathers?" Sergeant Lake asked. Miss Marple settled, herself on a nearby stool, her knitting bag in her lap. "I believe, Sergeant, that we're looking at the evidence of a rather clever deception. Yesterday afternoon, Miss Dacre borrowed Mrs. Bantry's hat with the red feather and wore it out in the rain to create the impression that Mrs. Bantry was leaving the house at the crucial time." She paused to organize her thoughts, her needles beginning their familiar rhythm. However, the rain would have flattened and damaged the feather considerably. When she returned, she needed to restore it to its original appearance so that no one would suspect it had been worn out in such weather. Inspector Slack was following her reasoning with growing interest, so she treated the damaged parts with shellac to stiffen them. Exactly. But the tips of the feathers were too badly damaged to save, so she had to cut them off and burn them to destroy the evidence of the weather damage. Then she used theatrical makeup, grease paint, to touch up any obvious imperfections and applied fresh shellac to make the remaining plumage look as pristine as if it had never been exposed to rain. Mrs. Beddoes shook her head in amazement. Such lengths to go to for deception, and her asking for matches to seal a letter when what she really wanted was to burn those feather bits. It shows considerable forethought and skill, Miss Marple agreed. The kind of expertise one might expect from someone with theatrical training. An actress would understand about costume, makeup, and the small details that make a disguise convincing. Sergeant Lake made careful notes while Inspector Slack continued his examination of the burnt remains. "There's definitely grease paint here," he confirmed, "and these shellac fragments match the piece you found in the blue room hearth." "The question now," Miss Marple said quietly, "is whether this evidence, combined with what we discovered last night, is sufficient to reconstruct the entire sequence of events." She set down her knitting and moved to examine the ashes herself. "Inspector, I believe we can now piece together exactly how this murder was planned and executed. Miss Dacre had both the opportunity and the specialized knowledge necessary to create such an elaborate deception." Inspector Slack straightened up, dusting ash from his hands. The telephone impersonation, the stolen sachet for scent, the hat and scarf disguised to create a false alibi. "And don't forget the forged note with its careful schoolroom penmanship," Miss Marple added. "An actress would certainly have the skills necessary to mimic different styles of handwriting for various roles." Mrs. Bedos had been listening with growing indignation. To think of that woman sitting at our tea table, acting the perfect guest, when all the while she was planning to commit murder and blame poor Mrs. Bantry. "I'm afraid it's even worse than that," Miss Marple said gently. "The evidence suggests this wasn't a crime of passion, but a carefully premeditated murder designed from the beginning to implicate Mrs. Bantry." She moved to the window and looked out at the November garden, where the rain had finally stopped, but left everything sodden and gray. Someone who knew Mrs. Bantry's habits well enough to forge her handwriting style, knew about the violet sachets in the blue room, and was familiar enough with the house to know about the telephone extension in the anteroom. Someone who was staying as a house guest and had plenty of opportunity to observe and plan, Inspector Slack concluded grimly. "Indeed, and someone who had compelling reasons for wanting Mr. Witchley's silence permanently." The small group stood in contemplative silence, the implications of their discoveries settling over the scullery like the gray November light filtering through the windows. The burnt feathers and grease paint told a story of calculated deception that went far beyond a simple crime of passion. "I think," Miss Marple said finally, "it's time we had a frank conversation with Miss Dacre. The evidence we've gathered should be quite sufficient to encourage her to tell us the truth about yesterday's events." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "Sergeant Lake, ask Miss Denham to join us in the drawing room and request that Miss Dacre come down as well, regardless of her state of health. I believe her recovery has been quite remarkable enough for our purposes." As they prepared to leave the scullery, Miss Marple paused to take one final look at the burnt fragments in the grate. Such small things, she reflected, but how clearly they revealed the careful planning behind what had appeared to be a straightforward crime of passion. The drawing room at Gossington Hall had witnessed many gatherings over the years, but none quite like the one that assembled that gray November afternoon. Inspector Slack had arranged the chairs with deliberate precision, creating an atmosphere more reminiscent of a courtroom than a comfortable country sitting room. Miss Iris Dacre entered last, her theatrical training evident in the way she carried herself despite the circumstances. She was impeccably dressed, her hair perfectly arranged, and her complexion flawless, though Miss Marple noticed the faint scent of grease paint that seemed to cling to her despite obvious efforts to remove it. Veronica Denham sat beside her friend, her elegant features drawn with worry and confusion. Mrs. Bantry occupied her usual chair, with Colonel Bantry standing protectively behind her. Miss Marple had chosen her customary corner, where her knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm, while her mild blue eyes observed everything. "Now then," Inspector Slack began, consulting his extensive notes, "we've made considerable progress in understanding yesterday's events. Miss Dacre, I have some questions about your activities between 3 and 4-5. Miss Dacre's voice, when she replied, held all the clear diction of her theatrical training. I've already told you, Inspector. I was resting in my room, suffering from a headache brought on by the dreadful weather. Yet Mrs. Bedos saw you in the scullery at 4 hours asking for matches. I needed to seal a letter. Surely that's not suspicious. Miss Marple looked up from her, knitting with gentle interest. Miss Dacre, might I ask about the scarf that was found with Mr. Wychley's body? What about it? Well, it's rather curious. You see, I've been observing people's small habits for many years, and I've noticed that Mrs. Bantry always ties her scarves with a particular knot, a right-handed Paris knot, twisted in a very distinctive way. She demonstrated with her own knitting wool. Like this, you see. It's quite characteristic. Jane, Mrs. Bedos mentioned that she's watched Mrs. Bantry tie scarves the same way for 20 years. Mrs. Bedos nodded emphatically. That's quite right, Miss Marple. Mrs. Bantry has her own way with scarves, and it never varies. Miss Marple smiled, gently. But the scarf found with Mr. Wychley was tied with a left-handed loop twist, quite different from Mrs. Bantry's habitual method. She turned her mild gaze on Miss Dacre. I happened to notice yesterday when you were adjusting your veil, in the hall mirror, that you tied it with exactly that type of left-handed loop. Such an automatic gesture. People rarely think about which hand they favor for such things. Miss Dacre's composure flickered slightly. I'm sure I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, my dear. I'm simply noting that physical evidence has a way of revealing the truth, even when people try very hard to conceal it. Inspector Slack leaned forward. Miss Dacre, we've also discovered evidence that you made a telephone call yesterday afternoon impersonating Mrs. Bantry to lure Mr. Wychley to his death. That's ridiculous. The telephone exchange operator noticed that the caller said, Lady Bantry, a formality that Mrs. Bantry never uses. The call came from the Blue Room extension, where we found traces of violet scent on the mouthpiece and evidence that someone had been handling stage makeup. Miss Marple set down her knitting and moved to examine a photograph on the mantelpiece. I've been wondering about Mr. Wychley's reason for coming to St. Mary Mead. It seemed rather unlikely that a London columnist would be genuinely interested in village charity work. She turned back to face the room. Inspector, did you examine Mr. Wychley's personal papers thoroughly? We did. Most of it was routine correspondence, but there were some rather interesting letters about certain irregularities in London society. Miss Dacre had grown very pale, but her voice remained steady. I don't know what you mean. I think you do, Miss Marple said gently. Mr. Wychley was known for his investigations into scandal, the sort of information that could ruin careers and reputations, the kind of material that might drive someone to desperate measures. She moved closer to Miss Dacre, her expression sympathetic but implacable. You mentioned that you'd been having difficulties with the press in London. Unwanted attention, I believe. Veronica said, Was Mr. Wychley threatening to expose something? From your past? Miss Dacre's theatrical composure was beginning to crack. He had letters, private correspondence that he claimed proved certain indiscretions. What sort of indiscretions? Inspector Slack demanded. There was a married gentleman who had been generous, and there were questions about a previous marriage that might not have been properly dissolved. Wychley threatened to write about it all, to make me a figure of public scandal. Veronica looked stricken. Iris, why didn't you tell me? I could have helped. How could you help? Your reputation would have been ruined by association. Wychley had documents, photographs, witnesses. He said he was going to make me the centerpiece of a series about the moral standards of the modern stage. Miss Marple nodded with understanding. So when you learned he was coming here, you saw an opportunity to silence him permanently while ensuring that suspicion would fall on someone else. You used your knowledge of the house gained during your visit to plan the perfect frame. Inspector Slack continued. The stolen sachet, the forged note, the telephone impersonation, the stage sighting with the hat and scarf. Miss Dacre slumped in her chair, her mask finally slipping completely. He was going to destroy me, everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built. One scandal sheet story would have ended my career forever. But surely murder was not the answer, Mrs. Bantry said quietly. You don't understand. You've never had to fight for everything you have. You were born to comfort and security. I clawed my way up from nothing, and Wychley was going to drag me back down for the entertainment of his readers. Miss Marple resumed her seat, her knitting needles taking up their rhythm again. So you planned it all very carefully. You telephoned Wychley, impersonating Mrs. Bantry and using language you thought sounded appropriately formal. You arranged to meet him in the morning room, which you referred to as the small room because you weren't familiar with the household terminology. You put on Mrs. Bantry's hat and scarf, attached with her bar pin to make the disguise more convincing, and drove to the lodge to be seen by the constable at the crucial time. Then you return, I believe, Sergeant, that we're looking at the evidence of a rather clever deception. Yesterday afternoon, Miss Dacre borrowed Mrs. Bantry's hat with the red feather and wore it out in the rain to create the impression that Mrs. Bantry was leaving the house at the crucial time. She paused to organize her thoughts, her needles beginning their familiar rhythm. However, the rain would have flattened and damaged the feather considerably. When she returned, she needed to restore it to its original appearance so that no one would suspect it had been worn out in such weather. Inspector Slack was following her reasoning with growing interest, so she treated the damaged parts with shellac to stiffen them. Exactly. But the tips of the feathers were too badly damaged to save, so she had to cut them off and burn them to destroy the evidence of the weather damage. Then she used theatrical makeup, grease paint, to touch up any obvious imperfections and applied fresh shellac to make the remaining plumage look as pristine as if it had never been exposed to rain. Mrs. Bedos shook her head in amazement. Such lengths to go to for deception, and her asking for matches to seal a letter when what she really wanted was to burn those feather bits. It shows considerable forethought and skill, Miss Marple agreed. The kind of expertise one might expect from someone with theatrical training. An actress would understand about costume, makeup, and the small details that make a disguise convincing. Sergeant Lake made careful notes while Inspector Slack continued his examination of the burnt remains. There's definitely grease paint here, he confirmed. And these shellac fragments match the piece you found in the blue room hearth. The question now, Miss Marple said quietly, is whether this evidence, combined with what we discovered last night, is sufficient to reconstruct the entire sequence of events. She set down her knitting and moved to examine the ashes herself. Inspector, I believe we can now piece together exactly how this murder was planned and executed. Miss Dacre had both the opportunity and the specialized knowledge necessary to create such an elaborate deception. Inspector Slack straightened up, dusting ash from his hands. The telephone impersonation, the stolen sachet for scent, the hat and scarf disguised to create a false alibi. And don't forget the forged note with its careful schoolroom penmanship, Miss Marple added. An actress would certainly have the skills necessary to mimic different styles of handwriting for various roles. Mrs. Bedos had been listening with growing indignation to think of that woman sitting at our tea table, acting the perfect guest, when all the while she was planning to commit murder and blame poor Mrs. Bantry. I'm afraid it's even worse than that, Miss Marple said gently. The evidence suggests this wasn't a crime of passion, but a carefully premeditated murder designed from the beginning to implicate Mrs. Bantry. She moved to the window and looked out at the November garden, where the rain had finally stopped, but left everything sodden and gray. Someone who knew Mrs. Bantry's habits well enough to forge her handwriting style knew about the violet sachets in the blue room, and was familiar enough with the house to know about the telephone extension in the anteroom. Someone who was staying, as a house guest and had plenty of opportunity to observe and plan. Inspector Slack concluded grimly. Indeed, and someone who had compelling reasons for wanting Mr. Wychley's silence permanently. The small group stood in contemplative silence, the implications of their discoveries settling over the scullery like the gray November light filtering through the windows. The burnt feathers and grease paint told a story of calculated deception that went far beyond a simple crime of passion. "I think," Miss Marple said finally, "it's time we had a frank conversation with Miss Dacre. The evidence we've gathered should be quite sufficient to encourage her to tell us the truth about yesterday's events." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "Sergeant Lake, ask Miss Denham to join us in the drawing room and request that Miss Dacre come down as well, regardless of her state of health. I believe her recovery has been quite remarkable enough for our purposes." As they prepared to leave the scullery, Miss Marple paused to take one final look at the burnt fragments in the grate. Such small things, she reflected, but how clearly they revealed the careful planning behind what had appeared to be a straightforward crime of passion. The drawing room at Gossington Hall had witnessed many gatherings over the years, but none quite like the one that assembled that gray November afternoon. Inspector Slack had arranged the chairs with deliberate precision, creating an atmosphere more reminiscent of a courtroom than a comfortable country sitting room. Miss Iris Dacre entered last, her theatrical training evident in the way she carried herself despite the circumstances. She was impeccably dressed, her hair perfectly arranged, and her complexion flawless, though Miss Marple noticed the faint scent of grease paint that seemed to cling to her, despite obvious efforts to remove it. Veronica Denham sat beside her friend, her elegant features drawn with worry and confusion. Mrs. Bantry occupied her usual chair, with Colonel Bantry standing protectively behind her. Miss Marple had chosen her customary corner, where her knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm, while her mild blue eyes observed everything. "Now then," Inspector Slack began, consulting his extensive notes. "We've made considerable progress in understanding yesterday's events. Miss Dacre, I have some questions about your activities between 3 Quar and 4 Quar. Miss Dacre's voice, when she replied, held all the clear diction of her theatrical training. "I've already told you, Inspector. I was resting in my room, suffering from a headache brought on by the dreadful weather. Yet Mrs. Beddoes saw you in the scullery at 4:00 asking for matches. I needed to seal a letter. Surely that's not suspicious." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with gentle interest. "Miss Dacre, might I ask about the scarf that was found with Mr. Wychley's body?" "What about it?" "Well, it's rather curious. You see, I've been observing people's small habits for many years, and I've noticed that Mrs. Bantry always ties her scarves with a particular knot, a right-handed Paris knot, twisted in a very distinctive way. She demonstrated with her own knitting wool. Like this, you see. It's quite characteristic. Jane, Mrs. Beddoes mentioned that she's watched Mrs. Bantry tie scarves the same way for 20 years. Mrs. Beddoes nodded emphatically. "That's quite right, Miss Marple. Mrs. Bantry has her own way with scarves, and it never varies." Miss Marple smiled, gently, but the scarf found with Mr. Wychley was tied with a left-handed loop twist, quite different from Mrs. Bantry's habitual method. She turned her mild gaze on Miss Dacre. "I happened to notice yesterday when you were adjusting your veil in the hall mirror that you tied it with exactly that type of left-handed loop. Such an automatic gesture. People rarely think about which hand they favor for such things." Miss Dacre's composure flickered slightly. "I'm sure I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything, my dear. I'm simply noting that physical evidence has a way of revealing the truth even when people try very hard to conceal it." Inspector Slack leaned forward. "Miss Dacre, we've also discovered evidence that you made a telephone call yesterday afternoon impersonating Mrs. Bantry to lure Mr. Wychley to his death. That's ridiculous." The telephone exchange operator noticed that the caller said, "Lady Bantry," a formality that Mrs. Bantry never uses. The call came from the Blue Room extension, where we found traces of violet scent on the mouthpiece and evidence that someone had been handling stage makeup. Miss Marple set down her knitting and moved to examine a photograph on the mantelpiece. "I've been wondering about Mr. Wychley's reason for coming to St. Mary Mead. It seemed rather unlikely that a London columnist would be genuinely interested in village charity work." She turned back to face the room. "Inspector, did you examine Mr. Wychley's personal papers thoroughly?" "We did. Most of it was routine correspondence, but there were some rather interesting letters about certain irregularities in London society." Miss Dacre had grown very pale, but her voice remained steady. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Miss Marple said gently. Mr. Wychley was known for his investigations into scandal, the sort of information that could ruin careers and reputations, the kind of material that might drive someone to desperate measures. She moved closer to Miss Dacre, her expression sympathetic but implacable. "You mentioned that you'd been having difficulties with the press in London. Unwanted attention, I believe." Veronica said, "Was Mr. Wychley threatening to expose something from your past?" Miss Dacre's theatrical composure was beginning to crack. He had letters, private correspondence that he claimed proved certain indiscretions." "What sort of indiscretions?" Inspector Slack demanded. "There was a married gentleman who had been generous, and there were questions about a previous marriage that might not have been properly dissolved. Wychley threatened to write about it all, to make me a figure of public scandal." Veronica looked stricken. "Ed went to the morning room where Wychley was waiting, and when he sat down to examine the ledger you had promised to show him, you struck him with the letter opener." Inspector Slack took up the narrative. "You arranged the scarf to implicate Mrs. Bantry, stopped Wychley's watch to establish the time of death, and then spent the next 10 minutes cleaning up the evidence and preparing your own alibi. The cry that brought everyone running at 4:10 was your own performance, designed to bring witnesses to discover the body at the right moment." Miss Dacre said nothing, but tears had begun to streak her carefully applied makeup. "It was the small details that betrayed you," Miss Marple said gently. "The wrong knot in the scarf, the formal language on the telephone, the mysteriously dry feather, the stage makeup traces. Each one might have been explained away individually, but together, they told the complete story." Inspector Slack rose from his chair. "Miss Iris Dacre, I arrest you for the murder of Lionel Wychley and for attempting to pervert the course of justice by falsely implicating Mrs. Dorothy Bantry." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Veronica Denham finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I brought her here to escape her troubles in London. If I hadn't invited her—" "You mustn't blame yourself, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "Some people, when cornered, choose desperate measures. The fault lies not with friendship, but with the choices we make when faced with difficult circumstances." The drawing room at Gossington Hall had been restored to its usual comfortable arrangement, but the events of the past few days had left an indelible mark on all who had witnessed them. 2 days had passed since Inspector Slack had taken Miss Iris Dacre away in handcuffs, and the household was slowly returning to something approaching normality. Miss Marple sat in her accustomed corner, her knitting bag at her side, while Mrs. Bantry poured tea with hands that were finally steady again. Colonel Bantry occupied his leather chair, the Times spread before him, but clearly unread. The other participants in the drama had gathered at Miss Marple's request for what she called a proper sorting out of the facts. Veronica Denham sat quietly by the window, her elegant composure somewhat diminished by the weight of recent revelations about her friend. Dr. Haydock had joined them, as had the Reverend and Mrs. Clement, while Mr. Simmons, the solicitor, maintained his usual precise demeanor despite the extraordinary circumstances he had witnessed. James and Mrs. Bedos had been invited to sit with the family, an unusual arrangement that reflected the crucial role they had played in uncovering the truth. Even Inspector Slack was present, his earlier certainty about Mrs. Bantry's guilt, now replaced by a grudging respect for Miss Marple's methods. "I thought it would be helpful," Miss Marple began gently, "to review exactly how Miss Dacre managed to construct such an elaborate deception, and how the evidence ultimately revealed the truth." She picked up her knitting, her needles moving in their familiar rhythm as she organized her thoughts. The key to understanding this case was recognizing that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make Mrs. Bantry appear guilty while concealing their own involvement. The stage-managed suspicions began with the telephone call. Miss Dacre used the Blue Room extension to impersonate Mrs. Bantry, but her theatrical training worked against her. She spoke too formally, saying Lady Bantry, and referring to the small room, language that Mrs. Bantry would never use naturally. Inspector Slack nodded reluctantly. The telephone operator's testimony was crucial in identifying the impersonation. Indeed, then there was the matter of the red feather sighting. Miss Dacre created this piece of evidence by borrowing Mrs. Bantry's hat and scarf, pinning the scarf to the feather with Mrs. Bantry's own bar pin to ensure the disguise would be convincing to a casual observer. Miss Marple held up the bent pin that had been recovered. The pin retained 2 scarlet barbules from the feather, proving that the scarf had been artificially attached to create the impression of Mrs. Bantry leaving the house at the crucial moment. Mrs. Beddoes shook her head in amazement. To think she planned it all so carefully, using poor Mrs. Bantry's own belongings against her. "The violet sachets were particularly clever," Miss Marple continued. "Miss Dacre removed one from the Blue Room linen press, leaving both a missing sachet and a greasy fingerprint from her stage makeup. She used the sachet to plant Mrs. Bantry's characteristic scent in the morning room and on the Blue Room telephone, creating a false trail of evidence." Dr. Haydock leaned forward with interest. "But surely the forged note was the most audacious part of the plan." "Yes, the letter with DB in that careful schoolroom script." Miss Dacre's mistake was assuming that deliberate copybook handwriting would be less identifiable than natural adult script. In fact, it made the forgery more obvious when compared to Mrs. Bantry's flowing, right-leaning hand. Colonel Bantry's mustache bristled with indignation. "The woman used every personal detail about my wife, her scent, her belongings, even her way of tying scarves." "Ah, yes, the knot." Miss Marple smiled gently. "That was perhaps the most revealing clue of all. Mrs. Bantry's habitual right-handed Paris knot versus Miss Dacre's left-handed loop twist. Such an automatic gesture that the murderer never thought to disguise it." She paused to examine her knitting, checking the pattern before continuing. The timing evidence was equally telling. The stopped pocket watch at 4 hours was meant to establish the time of death, but the actual cry wasn't heard until 10 minutes past 4 by the hall clock. That 10-minute gap was crucial. It was the time Miss Dacre needed to arrange the scene, plant the evidence, and prepare her own alibi. The morning room clock being 5 minutes slow added another layer of confusion that Miss Dacre tried to exploit, Inspector Slack added. But it actually helped us understand that the scene had been set up much earlier. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Exactly. And the hellebore glass with its circular watermark showed that objects in the room had been positioned well before the murder occurred. If the glass had been moved during the afternoon rain, there would have been tracking and water spots." Mrs. Clement, who had been listening with fascination, spoke up. "But how did you know to look for the burnt feather evidence?" The faint scent of stage grease in the morning room suggested theatrical materials had been present. When we learned that Miss Dacre had asked for matches to seal a letter, but was actually burning something in the scullery, it became clear she was destroying evidence of her restoration work on the feather. The burnt plume tips in the scullery. Great confirmed this deception. "Most ingenious," Mr. Simmons observed, "though I must say it seems an extraordinary amount of effort for what was ultimately a futile attempt." Miss Dacre was fighting for her career and reputation, Miss Marple replied with sympathy. Mr. Wychley's papers, which Inspector Slack examined, revealed the extent of his threats. He possessed correspondence about financial improprieties, questions about a previous marriage, and evidence of relationships that could have destroyed her professionally. Veronica Denham finally spoke, her voice heavy with guilt. If I had known what she was facing in London, I would never have brought her here. The irony is that I invited her to the country to escape her troubles, and instead, my dear, Miss Marple interrupted gently. You mustn't blame yourself. You acted from kindness and friendship. Miss Dacre's troubles were of her own making, and her choice to resolve them through murder was hers alone. Inspector Slack gathered his papers with evident relief. The case against Miss Dacre is overwhelming. The physical evidence, the witness testimony, and her own confession combine to ensure justice will be served. And Mrs. Bantry is completely cleared of any suspicion. Though I must say, Dr. Haydock added firmly, it's disturbing how easily an innocent person can be made to appear guilty when someone sets their mind to it. Colonel Bantry rose and moved to stand behind his wife's chair. The whole experience has been a nightmare. To think that we welcomed that woman into our home, never suspecting. She was very convincing, Mrs. Bantry said quietly. Even knowing what I know now, I can barely believe that someone could be so calculating. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked around the room at the assembled company. In my experience, the most dangerous criminals are often those who appear most respectable and charming. Miss Dacre's theatrical training served her well in maintaining her innocent facade, even while constructing an elaborate murder plot. She paused, her mild blue eyes thoughtful. The tragedy is that Mr. Wychley, for all his unpleasant characteristics, was ultimately killed not for his crimes, but for his knowledge. His threatened exposé was based on factual information, however unsavory his motives for using it. Justice will be served, Inspector Slack said firmly. Miss Dacre will face trial for murder and for attempting to pervert the course of justice. The evidence is conclusive. As the gathering began to disperse, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room with Mrs. Bantry. The November afternoon was drawing in early, but the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over Gossington Hall for days had finally lifted. I can't thank you enough, Jane, Mrs. Bantry said warmly. If you hadn't seen through all those planted clues, evidence has a way of revealing the truth, my dear, if one looks at it carefully enough. The important thing is that justice has been done, and your name has been cleared. Mrs. Bantry moved to the morning room doorway, where she stood looking into the space where Wychley had met his end. I've been trying to work up the courage to go back in there and arrange the flowers. It seems foolish, but the room still feels tainted somehow. Miss Marple joined her, her expression understanding. Suspicion is rather like stage scent, isn't it? It fills a room immediately and seems to permeate everything, but in the end it lingers only where it was deliberately applied. Together they entered the morning room, where Mrs. Bantry busied herself with the chrysanthemums, while Miss Marple settled into a chair with her knitting. The November light filtering through the windows seemed less gray than before, and Gossington Hall began slowly to feel like home.